Thank you, Sergey. I am so glad to see you because I've been waiting 25 years to meet you. And the reason I say that is because 25 years ago, together with my friends at the Institute for Humane Studies, I sent to the USSR a gift that was in those boxes which were labeled scientific books. Now you might wonder why I was sending scientific books, over a ton of books, scientific books, to the Soviet Union 25 years ago. And I'm going to see if you can guess what kind of books those were. I'll let you listen to my talk, and then at the end we'll see if you can figure out what that has to do with my talk tonight. I'm going to ask some questions and hopefully give you some answers tonight about the subject of my next book, which I'm tentatively titling in the form of a question, Your Next Government? In the form of a question, because I won't pretend to have all the answers, but these are interesting questions, and I hope to at least tonight discuss with you some of the themes that I hope to address in my book, and offer you a big picture view of historical developments, most notably with regard to the nation state. So here are some questions that I want to address with you tonight. Can we do better than the nation state? How can consent, the idea of mutual agreement, help us find answers to the problems of the nation state? Where is paradise? Something we all care about. I'll offer you some direction on that. And what does history teach about the development of the nation state? I think you'll discover it teaches some very surprising things. And lastly, what might the future bring? I'm actually working in this field, and I hope great things are on the way. No one knows, but I'll tell you what I see. Let's start with this very abstract picture of where we are today. I think this is in some ways a picture of where we are today. Right there is a local maximum. A local maximum. It's like a hill. And it's better than the surrounding area, but it's perhaps not the best we can do. You can see there's a higher ground, but it's shrouded in cloud. It's like a mountain with its peak hidden. And the question is, are we stuck on a local maximum? Is the nation state, as good as it is, and it does have some virtues, just sort of good? Is there something better? I think so. I think it's not simply that we're in a local maximum. I think the situation is actually a little worse than that. It's not simply that we could do better. It's that we're not in a good place. It's another picture of where we are today. A somewhat romantic picture. It's kind of dramatic. It shows some American Indians hunting buffaloes. And in a lot of ways, I think this is also a picture of where we are today. Unfortunately, in this picture, that is not us. The Indian is having a fine time. He's hunting and slaying buffalo, and he's doing what he loves. But that's not us. And that's not us. We are not, most of us, agents of the state helping it achieve its goals. Now, I'm happy to say we are not this poor buffalo in the foreground who's dead. I think we're more like this buffalo over to the side. That's more like us. We're hounded and harried and chased and victimized by the state, and we're trying to get away, but we're not sure if there's a better place. Like this buffalo, you might see those foreign, faraway lands, and you're not sure you can get there, and you're not sure that it'll be any safer if you do. So that is sort of where we are in a romantic picture. I'm going to the next one. There we go. So, one thing we might ask is, if I have problems with the nation state, can the private sector do any better? And I think that's a great question. You don't want to give up your local maximum if things are going to get worse. Can alternative institutions do better than the government? Great question. Let's look at a particular area where the government has shown it's very active, and that is in murders. It turns out the nation state is really good at that. Let's see how good it is. There's a lot of detail in this PowerPoint slide. I can't go over all of it with you, but in case you can't read the fine print, I'll briefly describe what's going on here. This describes the mass murders committed by the state in the 20th century. And each one of those circles represents the number of people killed by nation states in the century just past. You'll note up at the top, the very successful murderers are, alas, the USSR, Germany, and China. China leads the pack. It murdered over 30 million of its citizens in the last century. There are other equally tragic stories to be told, but this gives you an idea of the scale of the carnage that has been wrought by the nation state. Now let's compare this to the private sector so we can see how well the private sector competes. Let's do some very simple math. If we look at the world average murder rate, it is currently at about 6.9 murders per 100,000 people. And all we have to do to figure out how many private sector, we might call this private sector unorganized murders, all we have to do to figure out how the private sector compares to the nation state in this area is by doing the simple math where we get about 500,000 murders per year worldwide. Now let's go back to our chart and do the comparison. There's our chart. There's the math. We see 500,000 per year. And what does that look like on this chart? That little dot. That's about as many murders as perhaps, South Vietnam had in one of its worst years. Now, there's more I could say about this chart. I want to be fair to everybody. I'll say, first of all, in some ways this chart underrepresents the murders by states. Why? Well, you'll notice the circles are overlapping, and I think graphically that kind of hides the number of murders. We should separate those circles. Another thing, this does not count murders simply as a process of war. These are only mass murders in the form of, say, the Holocaust. It's not soldiers being killed on the battlefield. That's not measured here. But by the same token, I'll say, really, you should report that dot every year to get a measure of the private sector murder rate. I offer this simply to give you perspective. When it comes to murders, nobody does it as well as the nation state. But maybe you don't worry about that much. I do. I really don't think we're past that threat. It's not what I worry about every day. But you might worry about your money. And the question is, do you need to worry about your money with the state? And it won't surprise you to hear, you need to worry about your money and your life. So let's look at some charts to measure the effectiveness of the nation state in managing financial affairs. This shows the major world economies' debt levels as a percentage of their gross national product. You'll notice the trend is bad. These large economies are going deeper and deeper in debt. And there are several countries, including my home country, the United States, which are over 100%. Now, if you're a financial analyst, you'll say, this doesn't show that they're balance sheet insolvent, nor that they are cash insolvent. But you would also say, if this were a company, one of these countries, you would not invest. You would sell that stock short. Major nation states, the biggest economies in the world, are not managing their economies well. Here's another measure of that from the United States. This is an official government graph from the Government Accounting Office. And it shows that, in fact, the United States is cash flow insolvent, which means its expenditures exceed its income. And the trend is, this is the government making its own forecasts, worse and worse. So I don't think we can trust the state with our lives, and I don't think we can trust the state with our financial matters. This is some evidence. I'm sure you here in Russia could tell me stories about your own government's finances. But I just want to give you a picture, a quick picture of the problem. So the nation state is not really where we want to stay. It's not only a dangerous place that's likely to impoverish us, it's getting worse. We're on this little hill in a rising sea. That's not a good place to be. And you might ask, how did we get here? Did we choose this situation? Well, that's a question of consent. Now, I'm sure nobody came to you and asked you to sign a form. Do you agree to the nation state? Still, the question is worth asking. Did we consent to this situation? Did we consent to the nation state? And my answer might surprise you. I would say, sort of maybe, but not much. And that might surprise you because you might have expected me to say yes or no. That's usually what people think of when they talk about consent. They think it's a binary function. It's either yes or no. I don't think that's a sophisticated or accurate view of consent, however. Let me explain why. I think, in fact, once you study consent, as I have, you find that it comes in different degrees, or different flavors, if you will. There are different levels of consent. I've written about this. If you're curious, there's some academic writing I've done on this topic under the heading of graduated consent theory. It means simply that consent varies by degree. And you can see here that at the very top, the best kind of consent is express consent. That's when someone comes up to you and they really seek in earnest, in good faith, to get your agreement. It's the kind of situation you face if you perhaps are thinking of renting an apartment. The person who's going to rent you the apartment has to get you to agree. They can't force you to move in. They have to get you to sign a lease agreement. But there's other types of consent. Look at the second level down on the right, implied consent. Implied consent is, we might say, presumed consent. It's when you don't say yes, but you don't say no. And many people describe the kind of consent that citizens have to the nation state as implied. Because why? Because you didn't leave. They often say in America, maybe they say this in Russia, love it or leave it. When you complain about the government, they say, love it or leave it. If you don't like it, you can leave. And the argument is, if you didn't leave, you must have agreed. Well, I don't really think that's a very good measure of consent, but it's something. And then the last type of consent you see there, it's gray, but it's above non-consent, is hypothetical consent. And what is that? That's kind of theoretical consent. We say, you would have agreed to this if we had asked you. Now, the reason I lay all this out is because I have friends who say, my fellow travelers who also love liberty as I do, they say, I didn't agree to the state. They never asked me. I never signed a contract, so it has nothing to say to me. I did not consent. I think that's a little too simple. I think, in fact, to some degree, most of us somewhat consent to the government, but it's not as good as it should be. What we want to do is climb up that ladder of consent as much as we can. And the big project for me is finding ways in which we can climb the ladder of consent and make our social institutions as close as we can to expressly consensual ones. The model for me is like the agreement you have with your landlord. When the government actually asks you if you agree, if you're willing to sign a document. So you can see that there's a scale here, justification. The justice in our social institutions increases to the degree we can climb up that ladder of consent. Now, this is all very theoretical. Let me make it more concrete for you. One thing I think we can say about the nation state that makes it very questionable is the way it renders justice, because no one would agree to this. And I don't mean that no one would agree to Obama as president. He's not my favorite president. I didn't vote for him, but I will say that he's not that much worse than other bad presidents we've had. That's not what I'm getting at. I just like this picture because it shows Obama. It's a wonderful picture. It was taken just before his inauguration. just before he took the oath of office. And you can see he's looking in the mirror and he's recognizing what a historic figure he is, and he is. I'm actually glad Americans voted him into office. It was a mistake Americans had to make, and I'm glad they made it. But here's what you would never agree to. You would never agree, just as Obama is judging himself, that's why I like the picture, you would never agree if anyone asked you to let the state decide your complaints against it. That's just crazy. Would you ever do business with someone who said, I tell you what, here's the deal. If you have a disagreement with me, we'll resolve it through some sort of adjudication. And you say, that sounds good. Who's the judge? Me. So if we have a fight, you get to decide who wins? Yeah. You would never agree to that. In fact, I can tell you under US law, probably the law of every civilized country, no court will enforce a private agreement that has that kind of clause in it. And yet, that's how government courts work. If I have a complaint against the government, I have to go to a government court. Now, maybe the judges are somewhat independent, but the politicians chose those judges, and the government is paying their salaries. I don't think we can trust those judges to be objective. Now, I know what you're saying. You're saying there's no other way to do it. And that's been often the view, and I think it's wrong. But I do think this is a terrible flaw at the heart of the state. And yet, it is the very reason why one of the most widely respected thinkers about political theory, it's the very reason that John Locke offered for having a state. I'll read this quote to you. Pardon me for reading it through, but it's a great quote, and I know that you might want the translation. So John Locke said that we institute governments in order to remedy those inconveniences of the state of nature which necessarily follow from every man being judge in his own case, by setting up a known authority to which every one of that society may appeal upon any injury received or controversy that may arise, and which every one of the society ought to obey. So this is John Locke's argument for having a state. He says in a state of nature, two men get in a struggle. Without a government, they have to resort to force of arms, or one of them basically says, I know I'm right, so stand aside. Well, that will never work. So John Locke says that's why we need the government, to have an objective third party to resolve our disputes. Well, that works for private parties, but it doesn't work when you have a dispute against the government. So we see here a flaw at the very heart of the state, something you would never agree to, but you might think it has to be that way. There's nothing else. There's no better way. But you'd be wrong. There is a better way, and it has been developed by the private sector. This is a practice very common in the private sector. Let me describe it to you very briefly. Here's how private parties resolve this in their adjudication, when they adjudicate their disputes. Each party chooses an arbitrator, and each of the arbitrators chooses the third arbitrator. Okay, so we have each party chooses an arbitrator, and then the arbitrators choose the third panelist in the three-party panel. Now, neither party can dispute this is a fair procedure for choosing the panel of judges who will resolve their dispute. This is very common in international trade. If you want to look it up, it's in the UN International Convention on Trade, Article 9. I have a site for it if you want to see it. So it's very common in international trade. And I've written about this saying we should have the same thing in our disputes with the government. I call them citizen courts. This is an article I wrote for the Freeman. I offer you the picture if you want to look it up. And basically my argument is it's not fair for the government to decide our disputes with it using its own judges. There's a better way, and we should demand that the government use that technique when we have arguments against it. If this is the only thing you remember from my talk, this is what I'd be happy to have you remember, because I want to see people implement this. I think it would make the state more just and our world a better place. But I'll move on. I have some other things I'd like to share with you. I promised to tell you where paradise is. Well, it's not quite that simple. But I will describe to you another better way to run our social institutions. My suggestion to you is that paradise, or at least a better world, is closer than you might think. It's closer than you might think. And let me give you some examples. These are all private institutions that do the things that governments do and do them pretty well. Now here's a picture from a mall. This could be a mall anywhere. And why do I cite a mall as an example of sort of a private government? Well, think about it. When you go to the mall, it's kind of like a small city. It has its own streets, it has its own security, it has its own fire protection, it has its own utilities, it's got addresses, each of the stores in the mall, and it's a wonderful place to visit. So malls provide through the private sector many of the same services that you can get in a city, and they do it very well. But you might say, well, I like the mall too, but you can't sleep there. Okay, this is a picture of the Vegas Strip. I've been there a few times. And what's notable about the Vegas Strip are these casino hotels. And if you visited them, you can see they have almost everything you could want in a living place, plus some things I'd rather not have in my living room. But again, they offer private security, they offer you a place to sleep, it's a hotel, amusements, they have fire protection, utilities, all that stuff provided by the private sector. Well, you may think that's not quite close enough, but here's another example of how the private sector provides things that cities provide. This is the largest building in the world. It's the Boeing Everett factory. It's where they build 747s and other jet planes. It's a huge building, but it's not just its size that's remarkable, it's the things they do in that building. They have a workforce of over 30,000 people that show up every day. They have a highway system within those walls. They have electric cars and bicycles to get around. They have restaurants, 19 cafeterias. They have banks. They have their own security. Again, they do in this private building basically everything that cities do outside their walls. Other factories, such as Foxcom's factory in China, where they build Apple products, have on-site residences. There are people who work at those factories who basically live there. They sleep in the dorms, they go to the factory, they eat at the restaurants provided. It's like a private city. So when people say, well, we have to have governments to do these things, to provide security, fire protection, streets, they're just wrong. If you open your eyes to the real world, you see plenty of examples where the private sector does those things. I'll give you some examples from the United States. I don't know how common these are in Europe or Russia in particular, but in America, these are very common. They're homeowners associations, and this is a picture of the largest homeowners association in the United States. This is Highland, Colorado, and there are over 30,000 homes there and over 90,000 residences, and it's all private. And you can see from the picture, there's stores, schools, parks, roads. They have their own private security. It's basically a private town, and a good-sized town too. I like this example too. In fact, when we look at examples of private cities, I think this is one of the best examples we could have. It's called a co-op, a cooperative residential community. It's in the Bronx in New York City. It's called Co-op City. And this houses about 30,000 people. It has several schools, has 13 houses of worship, dry cleaners, doctor's offices, private parks, private streets. None of this will surprise you now. But I like this for a couple of reasons. One is you might be thinking, oh, private communities, that's nice for rich people, but what about everybody else? This co-op city is very middle class. It's about half black, about 25% Hispanic. It's got about 15% elderly. It's very solidly middle class. It's not just for the rich. And here's another thing I like about Co-op City. The way it's set up is quite interesting. You can see there are high-rises there, and the people who live in those high-rises are renting their property from the co-op. But the people living there own the corporation that owns the building. So I'll say that again, it's a little complicated. The tenants in these buildings are renting from the corporation that they own. So when you move to Co-op City, you enter into a lease agreement and you're given a share or many shares of the corporation that owns your building. So you are, in a way, your own landlord. I think it's a very interesting model. I'll return to this later when we talk about what the future might bring for private cities. Let's talk about special jurisdictions now. You might say, well, this is all very interesting. It applies to homeowners associations and residences. But I'm interested in political reform. How can we institute political reform at a larger scale? Let's talk a little bit about special economic zones. These are very common and increasingly so. These special jurisdictions, you might be wondering, why would a government ever give up power? Well, they'll do it, and they have done it, and they will do it for money. Let me give you a quick example or two of these special jurisdictions. Governments use these because they work. Probably one of the earliest examples of a kind of a special jurisdiction is Hong Kong. And it was founded by the British in 1841, and then in 1997, the British gave it up to China. And one of the most notable things about Hong Kong has been its success. The people there have among the highest per capita incomes in the world. They've filled up a very small place with expensive high-rises, and there's a lot of money to be made there. People worried what would happen when the Chinese in 1997 took over Hong Kong. They said, oh no, Hong Kong is going to be destroyed by the communists in China. And in fact, something like the reverse is true. It's not that China took over Hong Kong, it's more like Hong Kong took over China. And how did that happen? Well, the Chinese communists were not fools. They looked over the fence into Hong Kong and they said, what is going on here? It's the same culture, it's the same climate, it's the same race of people, but in Hong Kong they're rich. And in China, 30 million people starved recently because we govern so badly. What are they doing in Hong Kong that we don't do well in China? And basically, they had a different set of rules. They had respect for property rights, for economic liberty, and for individual choice. And maybe the Chinese communists were not completely happy with every aspect of that, but they weren't fools. And they realized if they didn't want to run their people into starvation again, they would have to do something like that in China. And thus they instituted these special economic zones in China. There's a wonderful book by Ronald Coase and his co-author Wing that's called How China Became Capitalist. Wonderful book, and it's basically a story about how Hong Kong, the idea of Hong Kong, took over China. And now China has many of these special economic zones. If you've been following it, it's one of the great success stories of this century, how they have moved their people from abject poverty and starvation to middling economic success, and the trend is good. They have saved their people from starvation through these reforms, and we can thank their foresight in learning from Hong Kong. Let's look at another example. We might call Hong Kong's effect on China the first generation of special economic zones. Because what they did is they basically set aside certain areas of their country where different rules applied, where there was more respect for property rights, where there was less government intrusion into private affairs. So we'll call that the first generation. Dubai has done something very interesting, a little bit different though. In Dubai they decided, well, we want to have a success in our region too. And we want to bring in those rules that will help people become wealthy. Where did they get the rules? They imported the rules from England. They said in the Dubai International Financial Center, the English common law will govern our financial transactions. That's really radical in a way. It's a government saying, well, we like our Sharia law. It's wonderful for Muslims, but it doesn't attract many international traders. We need better rules to get that money in our jurisdiction. And they got those rules from England. They basically borrowed the law from another country. And that's what they did in Dubai. It's been a fantastic success. I want to take a moment here to talk a little bit about Russia. Now, you know more about this than me. I had not really read much about Russian special economic zones until I prepared for this talk. And I've talked now with some Russians, and they've told me they don't think much is going on, but I think it's interesting. Russia has special economic zones too. And there's 4 types, and 28. There's 28 special economic zones in Russia now. And basically, I think Russian leaders, I guess it was Medvedev before Putin who actually instituted this, and they're trying to do something like what the Chinese did in their country with these special economic zones. Now, I've been told that they're rife with corruption and they haven't been a big success, but I do think it's worth observing that the Russians are trying this too, and I say, you know, good for them. I wish them luck. Maybe they could do it better, but they're trying. They're not alone. And in fact, what's interesting about this to me is that, in a way, Russia is returning to its past. In the late medieval period, Russia had within its own borders a city, you can see it's Novgorod, that was a member of the Hanseatic League. And in effect, local leaders in Novgorod said, we want to invite these traders into our city to bring prosperity to our region. And they gave them special trading privileges. And it was a big success. People with whom I've spoken who know more about Russian history than me have told me that this city was notable for being rather more liberal than other places in Russia. They also said, regrettably, they've sort of lost that history, but I wonder now if perhaps Russia isn't circling back around. It's taking a while, but circling back around to this idea that these special zones with their own rules can bring prosperity to their country. Now, so far, the SEZs have not done anything like brought in foreign law in Russia. What they do is they offer you lighter taxes, lighter customs and duties. It's easier to bring in skilled workers. And they have something that's very interesting. They give you what they call one-window services. So if you want to start a business in one of these Russian SEZs, you only have to visit one person. You don't have to go to a lot of different offices and fill out a lot of paper. But they've also made very clear that this is not for you, and it's not even for a small business. It's only for big businesses with a lot of money. When I heard that, I thought, this kind of reminds me of this thing I heard of, what do you call it, the nomenclatura? If you have enough money, you get special treatment and good government. And if you don't, well, too bad. And that's perhaps a shame, but maybe these things will get better for Russians, everyday Russians. Maybe someday they'll say, we shouldn't have to pay for good government. We shouldn't have to be wealthy foreigners to get the government we're already paying for. I don't know where it'll go, but it's interesting to reflect on, and I wish you all good luck. Let me say a little bit about the future of SEZs, and I think the future is more private involvement. This is a report from the World Bank about special economic zones, came out recently. And I want you to look at the numbers here. What's remarkable is special economic zones do not have to be run by the government. In fact, that is less common than privately run special economic zones. So if you look at the numbers here, you can see, look down at the bottom, this is just in developing and transition economies. This is not the developed world. But in the developing world, they have about 900 public zones and about 1,500 private zones. So most of the SEZs in the developing world are privately run. Well, why? Because it works. Here's a quote from that same report. Why are there so many private zones? Because, there they are, because, and I'm quoting the World Bank, they are less expensive to develop and operate and yield better economic results. So I think we're going to see that development with SEZs. Special economic zones offer us a way to improve government, and it looks like the way to really make SEZs work is to have them privately run and managed. I'll wrap up by saying a little bit about a project I've been working on in the real world. I'm not just an academic. Because I'm a lawyer, I also have clients. And one of my clients, Elevator City Development, Inc., is working in Honduras with their very interesting program. Not many people have heard about it. But it's very exciting. In fact, I got an email this morning that contains some good news about it. But you probably now know more about this than almost anybody in the world just because you know it's happening. And what's going on in Honduras? You might call this the third generation of SEZs. The Hondurans have done something really bold, really radical, very daring. They've instituted this program for ZEDs, Zones for Economic Development and Employment, that not only will institute special economic zones, but these zones will also have their own legal, administrative, and political systems. Now, they're not completely sovereign. They still are part of the Honduran government, but they will not be operating under the same rules as the rest of the Honduran government, except in a very few areas. For the most part, these zones will be self-governing because the Hondurans want them to succeed. Honduras right now is not a happy place. They have the highest per capita murder rate in the world. That's about 82 people per 100,000 per year. You earlier saw that the average world number was about 6 per 100,000. So Honduras is in a bad place. There's not enough jobs, there's too much violence, and they are trying something radical because they have to. They want to help their people. And what's more, not only are the Hondurans going to allow these special economic zones to go beyond economics, they're setting them up so they can be privately run and managed. And that's what the company I'm working with is trying to help with. They hope to be one of the private companies that will help develop these special zones in Honduras. So wish us luck. This could be the future of special economic zones, and we hope to take it to other countries if it's successful in Honduras. If you want to learn more about the Honduran project, I recommend you visit my friends at startupcities.org, the Startup Cities Institute. You can find it just with a search on the internet, and they are closely tracking this process in Honduras and other countries, and they're doing very good work. So please visit them and enjoy their website and learn more about what might be the future of special economic zones. So let's talk about the future, what the future might look like. So you'll see here, to go back, this is the picture I had before. Remember, I think with the nation state, we're on this local maximum, and we can see there might be higher ground, but we're not sure what's there. Well, let me tell you what might end up there. If we take the clouds away from that mountain peak, that higher ground, what might it look like? This is very speculative and theoretical. This is just me as an academic now, wearing my academic hat. Let me tell you some things that I think might be worth looking at as we try to imagine a better world. First of all, let's talk about how justice could be administered in a way that's better than the way the nation state does it. Of course, what we want to have are the fair courts I described earlier. So earlier I described the way the private sector handles adjudication and does it in a way that I think is much better than the nation state, because they form these panels through a process that's fair to everyone. So that's one element of a three-element judicial system. The first part is you form your courts in a fair way. Secondly, you use what is called pendulum arbitration. It's a very interesting process. It's very common in international trade. I'm not inventing any of this. I'm just finding things on the shelf that are already being used and suggesting we combine them. That's why I use the little Legos. These are my son's Legos. Pendulum arbitration works like this. Suppose you have Bob and Paul, and they have a fight. And Bob says, "You owe me $1 million," and Paul says, "I don't owe you anything." So they go to arbitration, and the way it often works is one picks 0 and the other picks $1 million, and the arbitrators kind of split the difference. That's not the way to do it, because that encourages Bob and Paul to disagree. With pendulum arbitration, you tell the parties who have their dispute, "We are going to choose the remedy offered by one of you two. We are not going to split the difference. So, whatever you put on the table, we're either going to choose that or we're going to choose the other party's proposed remedy." And you see what that does? That brings the parties to cooperation before they even get the final decision. Typically it goes through 3 rounds. Bob says 0, Paul says 1,000,000, and Bob looks at that 1,000,000 and he says, if they choose 1,000,000, I'm in a lot of trouble. Maybe 0 is a little bit stingy. And Paul does the same thing. Paul says, he looks at that 0 and he says, if they choose 0, I'm in trouble. Maybe 1,000,000's a little too much. And they go through 3 rounds of this, and eventually they end up pretty close. In fact, most of the time in pendulum arbitration, you don't even end up going to the judges. After a couple of rounds, the parties, they start converging, and they reach their own conclusion. It brings the peace. So that's step 2, or element 2, pendulum arbitration. So we form the court in a fair way. We use pendulum arbitration to encourage the parties to reach a peaceful settlement on their own. And then lastly, this is the way it works in most countries, not the United States, the loser of the litigation has to pay all the costs of the winning party. Again, I didn't invent this. This is the worldwide practice. It's the standard worldwide, except in America. And you combine these 3 things and you get this basic little building block. And I want to suggest to you that if this is how we administer justice, we could solve a lot of problems. We'd certainly have a better legal system than in the United States. It would be much less costly. It would be more fair than government courts. And this little basic building block, you could combine this just as you can combine Legos to create all kinds of things. This basic judicial building block, I think, could be used to support a very sophisticated and complex economy. Now, I'm just saying that as a theoretician. If you want to be skeptical, that's great. These are my ideas, and I welcome your comments. Let's talk about another idea. Is it better to be in a city that is owned or a city that is unowned? And I want to suggest to you that a problem that a lot of political communities have is that nobody owns them. So here we have some cats. These are unowned cats. It's not a happy thing to be an unowned cat. No one takes care of you. You want to be like this cat. You want to have somebody taking care of you, whether you're a kitten being taken care of by your mother, or whether you're the mother cat being kept by somebody. They have this mother cat in a box with a towel. And that's the problem with cities. Would you rather be in this situation or this situation? I ask the same thing with political communities. Would you rather be in a community where nobody owns the city itself, or a city where actually it's owned by someone? I think the latter would be better, because when people own things, they take care of them. You have a beautiful city here. I've really enjoyed walking around it, but it has some rough spots. You won't see things like that in a homeowners association, because when people walk through a homeowners association and they see a piece of garbage on the ground, they pick it up. It's their property. They take care of it. So I think we should consider the benefits of having owned communities, and that co-op model offers us a way to set up a political community so it's not owned by rich people, it's owned by the people who live in the community, just like the Bronx co-op city. I think that's a model we should consider for political communities. Now, we still have to worry that in a community like that, the people with the most votes will push people around. And so for that, this is the last crazy idea I'll throw at you. I've suggested we should have double democracy. Again, you can read the details in my article in the Freeman. But I used to be a skeptic of democracy. I used to think, oh, democracy is, it's 2 wolves and a lamb deciding what to have for lunch. I was very skeptical of democracy. And then I decided, no, the problem is we don't have enough of the right kind of democracy. So what I propose in this article is double democracy, and that means we combine 2 democratic processes. First, we use the voting system used in corporate law to choose directors in the corporation. And basically, the more shares you have of the corporation, the more votes you get. Well, that might not sound fair, but it does protect the property rights of the people who own shares of the corporation. The more shares you own, the more money you've invested. Kind of makes sense that you would get more votes. Maybe. But if it's a community, you have to worry about the rich people taking advantage of the poor people. And so for that, I suggest we need another kind of democracy, what I call corrective democracy, in which on a 1 person per 1 vote basis, we give the power to those people voting to strike down any law. Now, they don't get to create laws. That's very important. If you give the masses the power to create laws, one of the first things they do is they say, we get all the rich people's stuff because we outnumber them. And that's no good because the rich people leave and everybody's worse off. But if you give the masses the power to only take away laws they don't like, this can protect them from abuses without giving them the keys to the car. You don't let them grab the steering wheel, but you let them put their feet on the brakes. So this is the double democracy I proposed. Constructive democracy on a one-share, one-vote basis, and corrective democracy on a one-person per one-vote basis. See what you think about that. That's another of my crazy ideas. I'm going to wrap it up here by suggesting this is the hard problem, and I do not have an answer for this here, but I'm working on a book, and I'll tell you more about this in the book. The hard problem is, how do we get from here to there? Because if you look at this picture, you realize there's a low spot in between. It's all very well and good to talk about the high ground, but you got to go through this swampy area first. And that is a very hard problem. I'm not going to offer you the answer here. I just want to be frank in admitting it is a problem, and that's something that good people are working on. So let's wrap up, and then I'll take your questions. I've offered you some questions, and I hope you've gotten some answers. Can we do better than the nation state? Well, I sure hope so. I think we can. I think we have to. It's not a safe place to stay. What about consent? You know, the beauty about consent is everybody agrees that we should agree to things. How can you be against consent? And I think if we aim for consent-rich communities, we will all end up better off, just one step away. We're going to get to paradise step by step by step, and I think we're going to do it by increasing the private governance in our lives. What about history? If you study history, you discover the nation state is a relatively recent creation. It's not written in stone. It's the only way for people to live together. It's been done differently in the past. And increasingly, it's being done differently today. Today, special economic zones have lifted millions of Chinese out of poverty. They're working all over the world. You have them in Russia, too. Maybe they're not working the way they should, but I'm sure you can fix that. And the Hondurans are doing some really interesting stuff with their ZDs. That could really change the world. You guys now know more about that than almost anybody, just because you've heard the word ZD. And what are we aiming at? Well, of course we're aiming at a better world. We want a more prosperous, freer, or more harmonious world. Now, I do not have all the answers, but I think together we can start heading that way, maybe using some of the tools I've described today. But I told you at the beginning that I was so happy to see you, because 25 years ago, I packed up those boxes of books, and now I'll tell you what was in them. They were scientific books. We called them scientific books to get them through customs, and it was the humane sciences that they concerned. Those books, over a ton of those books that we didn't ship directly to Russia, to the USSR, because we couldn't do that. We sent them to Vienna, and then we basically got them into Russia by having our friends smuggle them in from Vienna in suitcases. And so 25 years ago, I helped send these books. This is Friedman and Hayek, great philosopher economists, writing about freedom, translated into Russian. We sent those to the USSR because we were hoping that someday, if we helped those people discover the ideas of liberty, that we'd be able to visit and tell them more about liberty. And I just have to say, I'm so happy to be here to meet you. You were exactly the people I wanted to meet 25 years ago. And 25 years from now, well, I think it'll be even better. Thank you.